panel, and also on a panel within the Churches of Christ. Peter volunteers at Sea Rescue at West Beach with your dad, and it must be a lot of fun to do that together. Peter is a self-described, self-taught computer nerd, and I suspect that might be a useful skill to have as you are about to take up a new role, still with Uniting Communities, but engaged in a project at Flinders University that we heard a little bit about offline earlier on big data and how it impacts people in our society. But tonight, the topic of loneliness, and I initially had the linkage with Peter from Adrian Brown, who had suggested that I get in touch with Peter about the work that Uniting Communities have been doing on loneliness. And I thought, Peter, maybe you could kick it off by just giving us a little bit of a background about what work yourself and Uniting Communities have been doing in that loneliness area. And thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael, for those kind words. It's great to be here. It's a great idea to stop and think, what's the journey? What's a theme that we might journey on? So that's a great idea. The Uniting Communities, if I went back 100 years, the Uniting Communities has always had a preacher or someone who's engaged in public discussion. There have been different characters that have done that, and this now has sort of been shaped into, we call it, we take a systematic view of poverty and disadvantage. In other words, we're interested in what are the drivers that sit behind, what are the things that sit behind topics that mean we have a high use of alcohol and other drugs? What are the things that sit behind domestic violence? Because you can look at it like a social worker does in the moment, but then you can go, well, what's the prevention bit of that? And if you want to go there, you have to understand what sits back behind that. I think just before COVID started, in the 12 months beforehand, we'd had this long conversation with our people at work, staff, clients, about what was going on in our community. And the topic, because sometimes we'll start and just ask an open question. What do you think's really affecting people in our community? And the topic of loneliness started to come up. And so we went, oh, okay, I hadn't thought about that. So then we took 12 months to design a survey, and the week we ran the survey, it was like 1 or 2 weeks either side of the start of COVID. So it looks like we planned COVID to match our survey, but actually it means it's interesting that we went into a thing we don't know a lot about. We can guess, we can make some guesses about loneliness, but why don't we ask to try to understand what sits behind it?
And what did you find from those surveys and that work, particularly around COVID?
Yeah, that's right. So what if I'll walk you through the sheet that's here. So here are the 4 questions. This is on the back of the page. The 4 questions we're asking people are, how often do you feel lonely? How often do you feel that you lack companionship? How often do you feel left out? And how often do you feel isolated from others? These questions came actually out of the UK. There are a number of groups that study and look at this, and so these questions are common across other research that's done in other states. But we've joined with a mob called Community Centres SA. Community Centres SA is very much interested in this topic as well, and so we've been asking these questions inside a survey that gets run by an external organisation for us. And so here's the responses we've found so far at the moment. So 57% of people responded feeling lonely often or sometimes. So you put those 2 groups together and you get 57%. The highest level, so it'd be interesting to guess, I had someone say, oh, old people are lonely. And I said, oh, hang on, have a look at this thing about age. The highest levels of loneliness were for people aged 18 to 24, so younger people. And if you turn over the page, the graph is on the same page. 18 to 24-year-olds, there's a real peak at 18 to 24, then it goes down, but then the next peak is in 50 to 54-year-olds, as in 75% of them, which is my age. I'm 52. It's interesting. The least lonely age cohort are for people aged between 60 and 75 years. Least lonely. So the trend is down over time, but there's a blip. We could have a talk. We've got some guesses about that, but we could have a look. Let me just keep going though for the moment. So there's the blip. Then we go. The next graph on the back is let's think about incomes, people's income. So we would look at incomes and go, the more wealthy people are, the less likely you are to feel loneliness. So the graphs tend to go that way, around the number sets there. And the last one's regional, because the survey goes across all of South Australia. So it's sort of weighted across South Australia. So the rates are similar, but we see loneliness is a little bit higher in our rural communities than in our metro communities, which isn't always what people would say or think, but nonetheless, here it is. So the interesting things about surveys, they give you some idea about the big picture. They don't tell you the story behind it though. So I'd have to guess about the 50 to 54-year-olds.
Yeah. Lots of interesting things in the graphs and what you found. The socio-economic influence is very interesting. It reminds me of this expat Australian, Professor Sir Michael Marmot, who's lived his life in the UK and done a lot of research into what's described as the socio-economic gradient of health. And the short answer is, if you want to be healthy, for God's sake, don't be born poor. There's this linear gradient, and the poorer you are, the worse health you have. And some of those negative health impacts include things like depression, not just physical health, but psychological ill health. And I'm wondering whether maybe some of the other metrics that you've done, whether there is also a socio-economic gradient that you might have found with some of the other things like depression, etc.
Yes, that's a good question. I will come to it. I'll go back a step. What's interesting about this is we're not really a university. So if the university sector looked at this and you were doing a PhD and you're into data and all that sort of stuff, you would probably go another level in terms of the way in which it was constructed. I guess it's to say that it is only 4 questions, whereas most, if you were really teasing that apart, you'd have to push it another step. Your question about incomes, we don't do this very often, and I think we would have to head off to the university sector to find out what income, socio-economic group, and how that affects each of these items. So I know, well, one of the area that you mentioned before, older women and poverty, that was a topic that we've been running, and we've sort of dropped it into another frame now, which is just about the cost of renting. So we think we're seeing more and more senior women ending up in poverty, and so here's the socio-economic. So if you end up divorced, you haven't got a good income stream because the male partner has had the larger job, and so over time you end up with the way rents are going up now. It's really damaging our community, and it's going to really damage people who are on low incomes. Yeah. So it will be in that topic. Another topic which mightn't be so clear is alcohol and other drugs. Sometimes especially alcohol usage. It's not, I suspect it's not as easily graphed against income as this is. But, yeah. So do you want me in my pitch? Let me make my pitch on the peak, because we actually don't know. So we've had a conversation about this. When we look at that peak, we've got the gender numbers behind that as well. It's weighted towards men. It's weighted towards me and my generation. And so when we've had a chat about this at work, and even I've had a chat to Catherine, my other half at home, she'd go, well, fellas like you are not good at keeping relationships over time. Look, Peter, how many, Catherine's got all these relationships with people, because we were converted into the charismatic church, really engaged with that. That started, it all sort of fell apart at some point. And then I ended up, my placement went from Bulkham Park to Pilgrim Church, then up to Rosefield, out to Renmark, where I was the parish minister, and then from Renmark, Adelaide Central, Uniting Communities. Well, Catherine still talks to nearly everyone who's at Brooklyn Park, and I just haven't done that. I've managed to, she goes, just look at your own life, Peter. You have all these people that you haven't kept connections with. Why do middle-aged men, why are you so poor at keeping relationships with people? And I said, I've got 3 friends. I think that's pretty good.
Three friends is better than none.
It is better than none. But it is an interesting, of course, this is anecdotal and a survey sample of 1, but nonetheless.
Well, make that 2, because certainly anecdotally myself, I have observed that there seems to be a tendency amongst men to have relationships or friendships that are aligned to one's work or profession or one's potential sports that you play, shared interests. But the idea of actually having maybe a friendship group that goes beyond that. You leave work and you tend sometimes to leave those friendships behind as well. I've certainly experienced that myself. Yeah.
So, and then I'm married to a feminist sociologist, Catherine. That's her bag is sociology, and in particular feminism. So, and the topic of domestic violence is always going to land here. Why is it that there's a group of men for whom aren't able to maintain relationships, and actually they're that bad that it becomes destructive? What is it that's going on in our culture that we can't seem to manage that well? So, and again, it's not, because it's a big picture thing, it's not about individuals. You then go to what are the big drivers, what are the things that are around us that create that. So if we had a PhD student, you'd then say, go and dig into that and answer that question. But I think that'd be some of the factors that'd be there.
Yeah, one of the things that came up during your mention of COVID is some conversations I've had with people about their processing of the isolation that COVID did, with the times we couldn't get out of the house or we were restricted in many ways. People process that very differently, and I noticed many people who were more introverted who said, this is great, really enjoying it, having a lot of time by myself, and other people were just climbing the walls. And I wonder whether part of the loneliness side of it is to do with how we interpret a situation, and introverts and extroverts tend to interpret a situation perhaps a little bit differently. And the difference between loneliness and being alone, the little diagram that we had a look at on the table groups, where you've got someone in a crowd, you're not alone, but people can be lonely in a crowd. And yet someone who is alone can be, I'm not lonely. And so that being alone is an objective reality. You're either alone or you're not alone, whereas feeling lonely is a subjective interpretation. And I'm wondering whether Uniting Communities or any of the research sort of got into that, how people interpret their experience.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think what we've, because we're a small unit, so the person who really runs this project is a person just out of university. Her name's Rachel, and she's really jumped into this. And we tended to try to ask the question, okay, if we're asking these questions, let's pull a group together and ask, well, if we know, I know, let's go to the young people number, yeah? So the young person number's really high. In a way, we're not surprised by that, because we know young people have to go through this process where they form their own identity. So, my eldest daughter, Miranda, sort of went through that phase, and I'm still talking to her. She lives at home, we're doing really well, but there was this phase where she's trying to work out, well, who am I? And I'm over and opposed to who's in front of me. So we know that young people certainly experience loneliness. And we also know that for young people, if that gets crippling, it can be devastating. So the effects of loneliness or isolation for young people can be profound. And so we pulled together, now I'm going to say to Tim's going to pull up a video for us. We thought, well, in the last 12 months, we pulled some small groups together to say, well, okay, this is what we've found out. Talk to us about not just loneliness, but what do you think we could do or should be done or could be done about that? And here is a bit of creative work that a group of young people did. And I think once we're ready to go, Tim can pop it up on the screen for us. Thank you very much.
One little moment. That's all this is. 90 seconds to change your life? Your life? Or is it mine? Ours? Us? What if we let go? What if we look up, listen, open up, speak out, scream? What if I was to say, hi? Hi. What happens when we reach out? When we see the invisible, when we listen to the silence, what do you hear? What do you see? Me? Am I alone? Are we alone? Well, what would you say? Would you stay? For just one little moment? That's all this is. 90 seconds to connect, to say, I see you, I hear you, I am you. I am you. And that's what reminds me that I'm not alone. We are not alone. Our pain, these scars, those fears, this isolation, it's not about you, it's not about me, it's about us and this one little moment. That's all it is. 90 seconds to beat the blame, the shame, the stigma, to say hell with them, and then to just chase it, hunt connection, but not just any, make it meaningful, let it last and just soak in that one little moment together.
It's a good video.
What stood out to you about that, Michael?
There are a couple of things, but one of the words was connection. And I've been trying to get my head around loneliness, trying to define it, and often we might think it was, okay, for example, you've lost a partner. I've lost my wife some years ago. I've remarried to my beautiful Karen. There were periods after Joy died where I felt intensely alone and intensely grieving. And there are other experiences where we may have broken up in a relationship, or we may have left work and left this connection of friends, and we feel that we don't have those. But I almost think that loneliness is, in a sense, a disconnection, and it's not necessarily a disconnection from people per se, but it can be. But it's kind of like a disconnection from life itself. When you're feeling lonely, your life kind of seems to have contracted around you, that you're disconnected from people. And in that video, there was this thing, hunt connection. So connection is the opposite of loneliness, that you reconnect with other human beings, with life, maybe with your deeper self. And I loved the thing, it's not about me. It's not about me.
What's going on there?
And that thing about loneliness, in a way, with those feelings of connection that have gone away, sort of contract into oneself, that it has become about you. And in a way, your life becomes you because you're alone, you're disconnected. And then to realise, my life is not about me. My life is actually about connection, and then kind of reaching out and reaching out to the other person. Hey, I'm interested in you. And the focus is no longer in here, it's out there. And I kind of wonder whether they've hit on kind of at a broad level a solution to that loneliness thing. Don't look in here, look out there. Focus out there and seek connection out there. I really like the way they expressed it.
Does anyone else want to highlight something from the video? Anything?
Can I just say something?
Yeah.
Not about the video.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
There's this thing called the empty nest syndrome. It happens when your children are old enough to leave and live independently.
Yeah.
Now, your stats suggest that it's men more than women who feel lonelier during that age group. That age group when their kids have gone and their work is beginning to be less involving. They're moving towards retirement. Now, there are some women who stay with the violent men because of the sake of the children. But once the children have gone, they can go too. So some of those men are lonely because they now are alone. So I was thinking, empty nest, women being free to leave. The other thing that happens during that age group is often people are looking after their elderly relatives, so they're not home as much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks for those comments. I mean, this is where we're scratching the surface. The numbers are scratching the surface. All of these items are absolutely on the table. I think the thing. I think the other thing that has struck me about that video is we asked young people to talk to young people, and in the background is we know there's this thing called Bookface and the internet and blah, blah, blah. And so they wrote this and prepared this to speak to their own. So the voice is, that set is young people talking to their own cohort about what's going on there. And I think that's the bit that I like about that. We live in a world where the internet this is coming back to your example, means everyone is deeply connected, especially in that generation. Like my kids don't use Facebook because it's only for old people. So they're in all these other platforms. They are very connected, but still they can be very lonely, which is brought back to what you mentioned earlier about that.
A question that came to my mind when you looked at that 18 to 24 demographic and said they were very high on the loneliness, whether a study had been done pre and post social media,
Yeah.
and whether social media, with all its connectedness, has actually made people more or less lonely. Be an interesting question.
We need another research student to do
Another
that.
research student, yeah.
You know, so yeah. So the things that are, yes, so yes, young people are much more connected.
Yeah.
That's not saying anything about loneliness. Or actually, we know actually there's some real positives. There are some real positives, but there's a real shadow as well, of course, with it. So you get both in that environment, you know.
The differing numbers between loneliness between the young demographic and the more elderly one, which was actually much lower in loneliness, I wonder if part of it is to do with the skills that one acquires during life, that you see circumstances and you learn from things and you go, well, things happen and I don't have to apply this interpretation, because I think sometimes with loneliness we can not just go, I'm lonely, but then you go, why am I lonely? I'm lonely because I'm not interesting. People don't like to have me as a friend or don't want to go out. I'm not attractive. I'm not worthy. I'm whatever. And they're placing an interpretational lens on why they're lonely, whereas you go through life enough and you go through some periods of loneliness where you leave a job or leave a relationship and you go, loneliness is kind of part of life, and it's not because I'm intrinsically deficient, and I don't know whether that might be part of it.
I'm sure, yeah, there's a question here, but I'm sure that our experience built over time means that as we get older, we're a bit more resilient about. We can see loneliness is part of the human condition, but yeah. So the number. Yeah. So the data set is a weighted average to our population in South Australia. So the people who do the research for us, because then look at the numbers that there are in each of the age groups, and then make sure that we get a representative survey across the age ranges. So that's the first thing. The next bit of it is we're really doing 2 surveys a year, but it started after COVID started. We didn't start this before. It started, the first round of survey was inside COVID. It was just starting to scale up. So we don't, I'm sure if you had a research student, you could go and find a comparable piece of work that's been done by someone in South Australia. There's no doubt you could probably do that. But I guess we're trying to use this data to ask 2 questions. What's going on for us, and how can we, what is it that we might do? And here's the connection to Community Centres SA. So there'll be a community centre somewhere here in Blackwood that will have, that group, that sector, the peak body is interested in trying to make sure we understand loneliness, because they see their work as making sure people feel connection and get together. So, yes, I hope that's part of, oh, there's a question up the back, Michael. Yes, there we go.
So I noticed that you've taken your surveys of adults, excuse my husky voice. I would be really interested to hear what kids' experiences of loneliness are too, and wondering whether you're going to do that. Also, knowing that some children are lonely because of an associated lack of social skills. I was wondering how you saw that connection play out in others.
Yeah, so I think I've got an answer to the first part of the question. Then you might have to remind me of the second one. Just hang on. So it's easier for us to survey adults because then we don't have to go into an ethics process. I for my sins, am on the research ethics panel for CSIRO. To engage with children, takes another layer and level. So, and we won't go there. We are. I think if you sort of wanted to go into that research, you'd have to head into the university, because then they would do a number of things to sort of strengthen it. So, but children would be a good example of that. Yeah. And what was the second part of your question?
How you see the connection between what might be broadly called social skills and loneliness, because I'm used to seeing that again through a lens of children and how they have social skills and therefore can connect with others or not, and whether that might also be played out in older people.
Yes. Yeah, I don't have it's a good question. I haven't thought about that in that same way. The way that social skills, people's skills and abilities can help us with connection or otherwise. Have I got that right? Yeah? Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder, just coming back to the response to feeling lonely and how to go about it, and maybe it might tie in, Heather, to the idea of social skills and the like. I wonder, I'm thinking of an experience I had many years ago in New Zealand. I'd done a personal development course, lasted 10 days, and we went through all sorts of things and lots of personal learnings, and we finished the course and we're having our celebratory lunch, and rather than feeling elated as I was gathered around with all these people I'd got to know, I was in a room full of people I knew and I'd become friends with, and yet I felt really alone. I felt really isolated and lonely. It was like people weren't talking to me, they were talking to each other. I felt quite disconnected from them. And coming to Heather's thing about the social skills, something made me just stop at some point rather than focusing on myself. And I started to take a genuine interest in two people that were talking a few feet away from me. They weren't looking at me at all. I wasn't involved. But I started to focus on them and what they were saying and looking at their faces. And as I looked at their faces, I was reminded that these were people I felt a great deal of affection for. And I started to see that they were really enjoying their connection and really enjoying their camaraderie. And I started to enjoy it through watching them and experiencing their enjoyment. And it was as if I'd been taken out of myself. And I wonder if part of the skill, for want of a better word, is remembering to leave ourselves, remembering to take the focus away from ourselves and to put it onto the other. Because sometimes, whether it's depression or loneliness, it can be almost a prison that we're kind of caving in on itself. I think Luther described the soul as the soul curved in on itself, this depressive feeling. And I wonder whether that might be actually a useful skill to teach young children if they're having trouble, loneliness, to actually, I described it once as conscious external focus. So rather than, what am I feeling, forget about what you're feeling. Focus intently on what you're doing. And I've spoken with some people about, for example, the experience of public speaking, which some people are very apprehensive about, and said, don't focus on what you're feeling. That's your problem. you're focusing in here. And of course it's terrifying. Oh my God, what are people going to think about me? Don't focus on that. Focus on the people you're talking to. Look at these beautiful faces that you care about, and kind of almost miraculously the nervousness goes away. And I wonder whether other things like feelings of depression and sadness and loneliness might also help as well. I don't know if that helps.
What do people think about that idea? It warms my mind, but does anyone want to comment? It strikes me that teenagers going through that identity thing will find that near impossible. That they're trying to work out, who am I in this moment over and against, mum and dad and all that. So that skill, they have it. And they certainly have it with their peers and their friends. And so if those relationships are okay, you don't have a crisis. But if one of those falls, it sort of makes sense to me why that's a challenge, more of a challenge, because it's a high risk, it's a big moment.
And it's that difference between a young person who's, as you say, forming their character, forming their identity and their path in life, versus someone who's been through a lifetime of experiences and has got all those kind of tools in their tool belt.
And you can see loneliness coming and go, oh, I know what that is. This is where I'm here now. I have loved. I've had a partner for many years. That person's died. I live by myself now, so there'll be those moments. And so I will come along to nights like tonight and participate, because I can do something. I want to do something, be connected.
Yeah. I'm wondering at this point if we might take maybe about 5 minutes just to think about what we've been talking about and thoughts that you've had going through your own mind, maybe something that's come up from the table group exercises, and just in small groups or the person next to you, just take about 5 minutes and just talk about aspects of loneliness, anything that's struck for you. You can share an experience from your own life if you choose to. Don't at all feel compelled to, but let's just take a few minutes just to talk about your experience and what's resonated with you.
One one little moment. That's all this is. 90 seconds to change your life? Your life? Or is it mine? Ours? Us? What if we let go? What if we look up, listen, open up, speak out, scream? What if I was to say, hi? Hi. What happens when we reach out? When we see the invisible, when we listen to the silence, what do you hear? What do you see? Me? Am I alone? Are we alone? Well, what would you say? Would you stay? For just one little moment? That's all this is. 90 seconds to connect, to say, I see you, I hear you, I am you. I am you. And that's what reminds me that I'm not alone. We are not alone. Our pain, these scars, those fears, this isolation, it's not about you, it's not about me, it's about us and this one little moment. That's all it is. 90 seconds to beat the blame, the shame, the stigma, to say hell with them, and then to just chase it, hunt connection, but not just any, make it meaningful, let it last and just soak in that one little moment together.
I'm very encouraged by the hub of conversation. It means that things have sparked for you, which is wonderful. Yeah, I do. I need the Allison meditation bell, don't I? So, does anyone have anything from your little groups that you wanted to share? We've got a microphone roving around. Any? Got a couple.
How accurate do you think the answers are when someone is asked about loneliness?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a self-report. So, of course, that introduces another, what do you call it? Another variable. Like, how is there such a thing as could you find a measure that's not self-report around loneliness? Look, I think, I'm not sure how I would think about accuracy. I think, well, actually, here's what Uniting Communities is doing. We look at that that graph, and see that it's really high in the first for young people. And as we've already talked about, we've already identified ourselves that as people age, we get more skills. We're more likely to be more resilient. There are bumps up and down, but actually, the young people cohort, they're registering higher loneliness and they have less skills. So Uniting Communities has said, you know what, for this project, we're just going to focus on the young people now. We're saying, actually, and that's why the video exists, is we're going to keep working at how do we find ways for young people who've got thoughts and ideas about that, how can they make a contribution, whether it's poetry or whatever it is, to talk to their own cohort, because we've actually applied the effective question, which is actually, if you're 75 or 80 years old and are lonely, I'm not actually going to probably be able to help you with you very much, and your path has been set. But we have decided that we will focus in the young people cohort, and we will watch these numbers with interest. Yeah, that's a good question. I could pull it out for you. It's less than 1,000. It's about 1,000 people across. Yeah, so that gets done by, we employ an external organisation that'll be accredited in their process for getting a cross-section. And so it sits inside an omnibus survey. So it'll be a survey of a lot of different topics, and then you buy the 4 questions, and yeah, that's where it comes from. So yeah. Does that answer your question, or not really? Yeah, sure.
If people over 60 were genuinely less lonely or less likely to.
Yes, it depends. Do you think 60-year-olds are more likely to be upfront about that or not? That's the question. I tend to think as we age, we're more likely to say, nah, this is the way I think about this. I don't know. What do you reckon, Michael?
I don't know. If someone asked me, I would have thought as you got older you would have less inclination to pretend to be other than who you were. And so you might be more inclined to say, well, yeah, I am lonely, if you were. I don't know, Bruce. That's just a purely subjective feeling on my part.
Sure.
And I think that was one thing as I was sort of musing through this difference between being alone, that objective reality, and loneliness, which is inherently subjective, that there is actually no biochemical test you can do to guarantee that you've got someone who's lonely. They say they're lonely, they are lonely unless they're lying. But it is a subjective
We could ask them if they're lying.
interpretation.
No, just
Yeah.
Yeah. That's yes. Actually, which means the numbers would be a bit higher.
Mark.
Yeah. So the point was that an older person, what is loneliness? So an older person may not feel, like a young person might be disconnected from the internet for 15 minutes and they'll feel lonely, whereas someone who's a bit more senior might go 3 days and not even have worried about it. So if the question is really about getting to what's the definition of loneliness, and it's subjective, and, you know...
Obviously, given that these things that just have to rely on their own admission.
Yeah, so the questions come out, yeah, that's right. Well, there's a few others.
There's Lenona. Just
there we
wait,
go.
Lenona.
And this will help, because we get the message.
It has been mentioned the difference between aloneness and loneliness, but I wonder if sometimes people see them as one and the same when they answer these questions. Because they're alone, they feel that they're lonely, or loneliness means they're alone, and you know, I mean, I remember, I'm quite interested with the teenage thing, because I'm generally not a lonely person, but I do remember feeling very lonely in my early teens, because I discovered that my friends didn't think and have exactly the same ideas and thoughts and values as myself. I mean, how amazing.
Yeah.
But, you know, that's part of growing up and learning to accept and value the differences in people. And it's learning to understand ourselves too. It's a maturity thing. I don't know, that's a question,
Yeah,
it's just a comment.
That's a good comment. Thanks, Naomi.
Sorry, got another question. Are you going to go back and find more people age 75 plus? Because I think they might be underrepresented in this survey. There are an awful lot of people at home by themselves who are lonely.
So the data set will get run twice a year. The Omnibus mob assure us that it's a cross-section of our current community. That's where that comes from. Yeah? Yeah. Yeah.
Given that the survey didn't really look seriously at the older people yet, looking around here, we were probably thinking that we might be in that category. My question is one of those of us who might think we can see someone who is lonely. What do we do about it?
Yeah. Yeah. So can I flip that into I'll flip it into a different question. You can tell me whether I answered it or not. When Deidre Palmer, past president, social worker, worked at Uniting Communities for some years in the domestic violence topic for a while, said to me, Peter, at Uniting Communities and in these places, we do great work with people over a very short period of time. We are highly skilled, we're very clever, and whether that's in alcohol and other drugs or rape and sexual assault or young people or whatever that is, we're really good at intervening over a very short period of time. People's recovery, though, that stuff takes a lifetime. What you need to hear is communities, congregations, gatherings of people like you do work that we cannot do, because we are in no position to form a community that understands and connects with people over time. We don't need professionals to do that. We just need people to do that. There's not so many organisations around. Like the church is in an ideal place that we have done that in the past, and it's a ministry or a contribution that we're making to people's recovery, whilst we can be very clever in the ivory tower in the city, and that's really important. It's profoundly important, but that by itself is not enough. People's recovery from whatever it is that's gone on their life journey, loneliness will cripple, will make things more difficult. Connection and community, which churches and congregations and communities are, profoundly important in the recovery for people through their identity, through their journey over time. So I think if Deidre was here, she would say, the work you have already done, and the way that we talk to each other now, the way that we treat, I'll tell you the version I've been learning. The version I've been learning is I've got a 19 and 20-year-old child. My two daughters live in a very different world to the world I grew up in. It might sound like I know what I'm doing, but then when you've got two highly intelligent young people in front of us who live in a very different world, we've had some humdingers of arguments, one or two of them, and I can hear in the background someone saying to me, "Don't burn the bridge, Peter. You have to keep this relationship together." So it has taken me. They're still living at home. They still talk to me. So I guess I think that's the bit. How do we listen? How do I turn off my thing and then listen to people who have an experience that's profoundly different? In my case, it's younger people. But how do we listen and stay connected so that they don't end up isolated? Anyway, I don't know, is that my... so one of the reasons I'm here is because the topic of loneliness has profoundly got to do with recovery for people who've been in challenging places. But, I said I wouldn't answer your question, but maybe I did partly. Did you want to follow it up? Yeah.
But that's because I'm a halfer. Those who are here this morning will understand what I'm saying.
Thank you.
And maybe part of the answer that Peter was getting at is, uniting communities are analogous to an acute setting, a hospital, where someone goes with a medical condition, they're looked at, they're fixed, acute, very skilled application of certain skills, and then the person is gone. They're back in the community where their long-term health is based on how well they look after themselves and interact with others, etc. But I'm wondering whether, the answer, Peter, is community connection, whether it's places like, in the best instance, a church that's welcoming and inclusive, or community groups where people can actually make a contribution. Again, that, as the young lady said in the video clip, realising that my life is not about me, that it's about connection, about actually connecting with others, and maybe in a worthy cause that they're drawn out of themselves and out of loneliness or depression, to encourage people into that area maybe. One of the things that was raised earlier, I think, Mark, you said rather whimsically that a young person who's been not liked on Facebook for 15 minutes can feel quite lonely and underappreciated, but it might take an older person a little bit longer. I'm just wondering, there is something of that now generation where increasingly we want everything now. We want a nice house now, we might want a car now, we don't want to wait, we want our happiness now, we don't want our loneliness to last. And I'm wondering, in your little groups, whether anyone has had an experience of loneliness that was ultimately positive. And what I'm getting at here is a little bit like the dark night of the soul that is written about, where people can feel quite alone and abandoned, and that life has lost meaning. But in that space, it can become a transitional space where maybe you find out more about yourself. Maybe you actually go within and become comfortable with yourself and who you are. I'm just wondering if anyone shared a positive experience that had come out of an episode of loneliness.
He's got to turn on the mic yet. Here we go. So that the sound is up.
My
Here we go.
career was as a zookeeper at Adelaide Zoo. My first day at the zoo, I was the only female. So I walk into what was called the mammal office, which is where we met, got our radios, keys, etc., etc. And I walk in. It's a small room with about 25 to 30 men in it, many of them older men, a couple of younger ones. And there's a bubble of conversation going when I walk in, which instantly stops. Dead silence. All eyes on me as I'm walking in the uniform. And then Hans, who is the big cat keeper of the time, man in his 50s or something, said, "This is a man's room. We don't have women in here." So I felt intensely lonely at that instance and turned to walk out. When Hero, who was the elephant keeper of same vintage as Hans that had just said it was a man's room, who probably had the similar feelings and biases, but he was the union rep, and so he thought it was his duty to turn and say, "Penny, come here, sit here," and turned to the other guys and said, "Penny has been employed, she's here to stay. If anyone has a problem, see me outside." So I ended up making friends with both guys. Hans, in the end, had to actually teach me how to look after the big cats in the end. And Hero I formed a very close friendship with, and as did the elephant. He was the elephant keeper at the time, and the elephant just adored him. And gradually made my way into that sort of social circle. And after the first guys that sort of accepted me were a couple of the younger guys in their 20s who would let me sit at their table and have lunch and things and things. But that was a certain instance of extreme loneliness, you know, which turned out okay in the end.
Well done, but that's structural sort of, that's organisational, structural.
Probably more female keepers than male.
And a case where an attempt at ostracism, which would have led to loneliness of someone, you in this case, was addressed by courage on the part of one person to stick his head up and say, "No, we're not doing that."
He may not have agreed with me being employed, but the fact was that I was employed, and I was a member of the union, so therefore he had to.
Thanks for sharing that story. Yeah, it's a powerful story about structural isolation.
What's that?
Oh, just go forward a bit. Yeah, there you go.
Oh, okay. Am I nearly off the edge?
Yeah,
I was nearly off the edge.
the edge.
Thank you. Thank you. You're looking out for me, Estelle. Thank you. Sorry, was there a question? Got
I
distracted.
think there's over here.
I assume that United Communities is not the only group looking at this. Loneliness is a well-known issue across the country.
It's probably better for you to repeat it, I think, Michael. Otherwise I'm going to...
Loneliness is not an issue just locally, it's across the country. So what other groups, particularly government, might be supporting the cause that you are looking at?
Yeah, so for everybody else, the question is, United Communities isn't the only organisation that's looking at this, there'll be others. What's government looking at or looking at doing around that? So, there's a couple. So we've intentionally connected to Community Centres SA, as I explained. There is a national campaign or conversation that's running about that, and it's being run out of the eastern seaboard. So Uniting Care Australia, and there is a couple of universities and others who are running a larger project around that. We decided we've watched that with interest, but we participate in it, but we don't champion it in the same way as we could. I think we're trying to focus on this young people cohort, but there are larger groups that are chasing it. The other question about the government question, I think one of the things we've struggled with is, what is it that we should ask? So here was one of the questions we had. When the state election's coming up, or the federal election's coming up, what should we ask? Now, one of our colleagues at work had said, well, we should have a minister for loneliness. If you go to the United Kingdom, they have a minister for loneliness, and we just thought that was ridiculous. Well, it might be well-intentioned, but actually who would want to be the minister for loneliness in the first place? And is loneliness really the driving component of it? Like, is it the thing that do you take it on head on, or do you try to get it at the side?
Do you have a minister for depression and a minister for anxiety as well?
Yeah, that's right. But we have a minister for health though, you see? So they would say, well, then what's the flip of that? How do you flip that over? I think one of the things we have struggled with in the project is what is the if you go and look at the government, I know one of the things that we had was events, fairs, things that would bring people together. And of course, if you pitch one of these ideas, someone's going to come up and say, "Have you not noticed the ramping that's going on at hospital?" If we pitch the idea of events and fairs, something that pulled people together, it would be compared reasonably, in my mind, with yes, but there are all these other needs over here. And in South Australia, it happens to be hospitals and the ramping crisis. So this is my way of saying we've tried to think about what requests would you make of government. I don't think we've ever really landed that. We've thought about a few of the ideas, but haven't been able to be concrete enough to say, actually, here's a good thing that we should be doing that would capture the minds of politicians and would stack up against the other things that are in our that are in a demand that are a demand on the public purse. We'd be open to ideas about that, but we haven't really progressed that past that point. Can governments solve loneliness? Maybe they can't solve it. Maybe.
Well, I guess one of the things that we've touched on at different points tonight, including in our chat, is that there's so many aspects to loneliness. There's the loneliness that comes from having, how shall we say, not a fully formed skill set about dealing with the challenges of life and still forming your personality and your character and your path, and maybe not having a broader perspective that, hey, this happens to everyone. And then there's a sort of loneliness that is an intrinsic part of life. If you lose your wife or your husband or your child, or you leave a work group that you've been part of for 20 years, there is an inevitable loneliness as part of that. And there are some that are, truly where a life has been impacted by terrible losses, and you lose a job and you lose connection, that you can feel terribly isolated, and it's a matter of dealing with it and just coping with it. So I think there are so many different dimensions of it. Some aspects of loneliness are addressable through skills and experience, and others probably have to be endured.
Some of them are structural, about the way that communities function and include or exclude people on, whether it's race or age or gender identity, all those topics as well.
Julie.
So when you're looking at, you're going to focus on this young age group.
Yeah.
Why not target it in ways that is appropriate to that age group, like online presence?
Yeah.
Having
Yes.
Just restate it, Peter. Restate the question.
Oh yeah. So the question is how are we making sure that the contribution that we make reaches the age group we're talking about. It was relevant and reaches, which is why that video is actually off our Facebook page. So that video was made by 18 to 25-year-olds talking to their own, and it's in the social media space. So that's exactly what I hope we're landing on that point. Yeah, that's absolutely. So we will keep that conversation going while the project runs. So we're in a 3-year planning cycle, so that project's going to run for about 3 years. So I would expect that we would keep making bits and pieces. Yeah, that's absolutely our hope. We will do that.
We're close to time. Do we have any final questions, Leno? Yes, and we did, I guess, touch on that earlier, Lenona, and I was curious to know whether some people did have a positive experience of loneliness where loneliness was in fact a catalyst for personal transformation, or whether something good had come out of it. So yeah, it's an excellent question. Any final comments, observations before we bring it to a close?
Can I just say something about surveys? When I was at university 1,000 years ago, we were employed to do surveys. And back in those days, we actually knocked on people's doors and talked to them and asked their questions. And some of them turned us away and said, "Oh, I'm not interested, go away, go away." And others would sit down with us for half an hour and answer all our questions. And we learned a lot by doing it that way. And I'm sure surveys today are done.
And ring you on the phone.
Sorry. Done in a different manner. But back in the past, we used to actually knock on doors.
Yeah. So much has changed, hasn't it? Thank you.
Can I just conclude by offering, it was nice, Helen reminded me that we had a stunning gentleman by the name of Alastair Blake who was on our board for 8 or 9 years. Alastair was, I enjoyed his company, and we were sitting across the different tables, and I looked over at Helen and I thought, I know you, but I can't with the face mask. So Helen, thank you very much for saying hello, and thank you that Alastair in your community made a serious and generous and gentle contribution to my ministry, and he was on our board, so he made a contribution to Uniting Communities some years ago. So thanks for that. It was a lovely memory. It was nice to say hello. So and thanks to everyone for this as well.
Now, bear with. Peter, I'd like to thank you on behalf of Blackwood Uniting Church for talking with us tonight, and thank you also for sharing what United Communities are up to and the work that you do. Absolutely brilliant to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thanks, Michael. Thank you.
One little moment. That's all this is. 90 seconds to change your life? Your life? Or is it mine? Ours? Us? What if we let go? What if we look up, listen, open up, speak out, scream? What if I was to say, hi? Hi. What happens when we reach out? When we see the invisible, when we listen to the silence, what do you hear? What What do you see? Me? Am I alone? Are we alone? Well, what would you say? Would you stay? For just one little moment? That's all this is. 90 seconds to connect, to say, I see you, I hear you, I am you. I am you. And that's what reminds me that I'm not alone. We are not alone. Our pain, these scars, those fears, this isolation, it's not about you, it's not about me, it's about us and this one little moment. That's all it is. 90 seconds to beat the blame, the shame, the stigma, to say hell with them, and then to just chase it. Chase it, hunt connection, but not just any, make it meaningful, let it last and soak, just soak in that one little moment together.